All right, I want you to turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 9, for our lesson tonight. Daniel, chapter 9. We're going to look at verses 20 through 27. And we have a real challenge tonight because I want to cover the 7-year tribulation period in this message as well as the mark of the beast. So I'm bringing these two lessons together so we'll be able, I think there's 22 lessons in this series, and so there's more than 16. So we're having to bunch a couple of them together and not say quite as much as I normally would. But tonight we'll begin with Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. Now I'm going to read this entire text, and let me just go ahead and say ahead of time, we won't be able to deal verse by verse with all of it. With some of them we will, but there's just too much in this text to cover this and then Revelation chapter 14, the scriptures on the Antichrist. But Daniel chapter 9, beginning with verse 20. And whiles I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplication, the commandment came forth. And I am come to shew thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? That's a ton of verses to try to interpret, especially if you look at them verse by verse. Well, let me begin by saying, have you ever imagined what it would be like to live without seeing one single Christian? Never seeing a Christian. Never hearing one testify, never hearing one sing. Well, someday that's going to happen. At the rapture of the church, every Christian will be called up, and the graves of the saints will be opened. And then after that, sometime after that, we'll see the start of what we call the tribulation period. Now, if you remember from the message on the rapture earlier, there'll be chaos upon chaos upon chaos on the face of the earth. With all of these believers gone, many of them in positions of authority, just suddenly disappearing. There'll be unbelievable worldwide international chaos. Economically, emotionally, and you could say in a sense, spiritually. But someone will come on the scene who will have the answers to all the world's problems. And that someone, of course, we'll see in the next message, will be the Antichrist. But I want to cover that period, those 7 years first. Then we'll go back and look at him as he comes to power and what all he's going to do. Now, here in the book of Daniel, in chapter 9, verses 20 through 27, we see what is called the tribulation period. Now, the term tribulation period is not used here. It is simply called Daniel's 70th week. And I'll explain that in greater detail later on. Daniel's 70th week is the tribulation period. And we'll talk about the beginning of that period, the middle of that period, and the end of that period in our outline. I believe in our outline we have 4 major points we want to focus on. The revelation of that period in verses 20 through 23, the determination of that period in verse 24, the clarification of the tribulation period, verses 25 through 27, and then last of all, the manifestation of the tribulation period. Why must there be a tribulation period? And we'll wrap up with those thoughts at the end. Now let's look at, beginning with verse 20, the revelation of the tribulation period. And there's sort of an intervention here by Gabriel. And Gabriel means champion. And it literally means champion of God. He's God's messenger angel. When God wanted to send a message to mankind, whether it's to clarify something they don't understand or just to deliver a message, he most of the time he used the angel Gabriel. So I look at Gabriel as the messenger angel. Michael, the other angel that's mentioned, I look at Michael as the military angel. When you see Michael, he's involved in battle. And just to add another note to this, it's not in my notes, but when I look at Satan, the devil, he also was an angel. He is the music angel. You see that in Ezekiel 28, and you see it again in Isaiah 14. So God chose Gabriel. He needed to get a message to Daniel, and he chose Gabriel to send that message. Now, he was sent to Daniel in chapter 8. So this individual was not unknown to Daniel. It's somebody he's already encountered on another occasion where he needed explanation on the vision of the ram, and I think it was the he-goat and some other things Daniel couldn't understand. And so Gabriel brought clarification for Daniel. And I might add that Gabriel also announced, being a messenger angel, he announced the birth of John the Baptist and of the Messiah in Luke chapter 1, verse 11 and 26. And he described himself in these terms, and I love this: I am Gabriel who stands in the presence of God. He didn't lift himself up being this great angel. He simply says, I'm Gabriel, I'm a servant, and I stand in the presence of God. As if to say, I'm always standing, waiting on God to tell me what needs to be done. So we have this intervention, and it comes, if you look at it here, it comes while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel. He's presenting all of this before the Lord. Then all of a sudden, Gabriel shows up. Verse 21 tells us the person. Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, that's the reference to, I believe it's chapter 8, he shows up again. And here's another interesting thing. He shows up at the time of the evening oblation. Now that's about 3 o'clock in the evening, if you look at it on the time clock, so to speak. And by the way, that's the same time that Jesus died on the cross. Here's what I also find interesting. Daniel didn't have a temple to worship in. He had no place to really gather and worship with the saints, but yet he's carrying on the religious practice of Judaism, though he's in a foreign place. So we see this intervention. But beginning with verse 22 and verse 23, Gabriel begins to give Daniel some instructions, some clarification. And notice in verse 22, it seems there's an element of confusion here with Daniel. And Gabriel says, and he informed me, or Daniel says, he informed me and talked to me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. Now, stated earlier, Daniel knew something about the 70-year captivity, and he knew it because of the writings of Jeremiah. Daniel had learned from Jeremiah's writings in Jeremiah 25, 11, and 12, where it was very clearly stated that Israel would be in captivity for 70 years. Now, by the way, when Daniel wrote his book here, he is an old man. He's not a teenager anymore. He is an old man. Some believe 80 to 83 years old. All we know is he's an old man. You would think as an older person, there would be nothing for him to do for God. But yet God is still using Daniel, and being in those latter years, he knew 70 years is the captivity period, and we are at the end of the captivity period. Now what's next? As an old man, he's wondering what's next for the Jews and for Jerusalem. So he's praying and asking God for help in understanding. So it brings a sense of consolation to my heart. Though Daniel knew the prophecy of Jeremiah, he still needed some help in understanding it. So if you're taking this course and all of these 22 lessons we've looked at, and some of it begins to be a little bit cloudy, and you're wondering, my goodness, how does all of this come together? Just join the crowd with me and with Daniel and with many others. Sometimes it doesn't come quickly. Sometimes it takes time to really bring all of these pieces together. Well, here's Daniel. He wants these pieces brought together because he loves Jerusalem, he loves the Jews, he loves God, and he wants to know, God, what are you going to do with your people in your city? So there's a measure of confusion in verse 22. In verse 23, we see the character of Daniel. At the beginning, Gabriel says, at the beginning of thy supplication, the commandment came forth, and I am come to shew thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. Greatly beloved. That literally means one that's highly esteemed. It's used 2 more times in this book before Daniel finishes. So Daniel is someone that's highly esteemed, someone that God could use. In Babylon, though, Daniel was just an old man. He was just an old guy that has had his glory days behind him, but in God's eyes, he's highly esteemed still. Really stands out. Now look at verse 24. Notice not only the revelation of the tribulation period, but now the determination of it in verse 24. There's the announcement of 70 weeks. Now let me walk through this slowly, and I'm going to encourage you to make some notes. If you write in your Bible, you may want to write some of these words in your Bible. But now listen to verse 24. We'll deal with the first part of the verse, the announcement, then later on we'll deal with the second part. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, that's the Jews. See that? And upon thy holy city, that's Jerusalem. So whatever the 70 weeks are, they are set. They are determined. One could say they are decreed. And it has to do with the Jews, and it has to do with Jerusalem. Now notice there's no conditional clause here that says, but if this happens, the promise is over with. There's not a conditional clause there. This is an announcement that's made that is determined, it's decreed upon the Jews and on the holy city. Now, the first 2 words that stand out in the text that are the key to understanding this ideal of these weeks of years and all are the first 2 words in verse 24. 70 and then the term weeks. 70 weeks. Now, this prophecy has nothing to do with the church, has nothing to do with the Gentiles, has nothing to do with the armies that will gather in the last. This prophecy has nothing to do with anybody but one group, the Jews, one city, Jerusalem. All right? Just keep that in mind. Now, the Hebrew term here for weeks is very important. It literally means, and when the King James translators translated the King James Bible, they knew this word very well. And they knew that this word meant week or 7. And so instead of putting a numerical term 7, they just put the word week or weeks, plural. It's important to understand that. And in fact, not in this teaching Bible, but in my old teaching Bible, in verse 24, where it says 70 weeks, I've underlined the word weeks, and above that I've written 70 sevens. Sevens. Now, are they talking about 7 days, 7 months, or 7 years? I'll bring that out later, but just understand, weeks or week, singular, means 7, and weeks means plural, sevens. Now, these are determined upon the people. Now, when the term 7 or sevens or weeks is used, the context of the Scripture must determine, is he talking about 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or 7 years? It's not always easy to determine what the writer is talking about. So you have to look at the bigger picture to understand, is he talking about weeks, months, days, or years? All right? Now, there's tremendous evidence in this chapter and the continuing history of Israel to prove to us that the 77s are not weeks like 7-day weeks or months, but 77s of years, which would be 490 years. Now, I'll come back to that a little bit later. But many Bible teachers, especially prophecy teachers, believe the 70 weeks refer to 70 years, and I'm one of those, and there's a number of reasons for it. Now, this is not in your notes, and I know I'm just really giving out information, but I want to lay a strong foundation on the interpretation there. Let me give you some of the reasons why I believe it's 70. The sevens are years and not days or months. Very important. First of all, the prophet Daniel has been speaking in terms of years ever since chapter 9, the beginning of it. He's been thinking in terms of years, not days. Even in chapter 8, he's talking about the 70-year captivity is over with. So he's thinking in terms of years in the broad context of the last couple of chapters. And so that's his thought, not months, not days, but years. There's a second reason. The context of the prophecy demands that the 77s be years, because if they were doing days, you're talking about 490 days. Or if you're talking about months, you're talking about 490 months. There's no way that all of this that Daniel said must take place during that time. There's no way it could be fulfilled that quickly. And even in history, if somebody would have said, well, I think it means 77s of months. Well, if you go back and check history, because you could follow the history, none of that took place. None of it. So it rules out days and months. So again, that leans heavy toward years. But there's a third reason. The concept of weeks, of years, was very familiar with the Jewish people. Not so much with Gentiles, but with the Jews. They were very familiar with it. The Sabbath rest of the land was to occur every 7 years, according to Leviticus 25, verses 3 and 4. They knew that. Also, the 7 weeks of years, the 7 sevens, which would be 49 years, they were supposed to let the land rest a year. They called it the Year of Jubilee. During the Year of Jubilee, all the slaves were set free. If somebody had lost their land because they got in debt, that land was to be returned to the original owner. So this ideal of 77s and years being combined is very familiar with the Jews. And Daniel knew that, and so Daniel would deal into who's he writing to? He's not writing to the Gentiles. He's not praying for the Gentiles. He's trying to get the mind of God on what's going to happen to the Jews in Jerusalem. So God's using that language that the Jews and Daniel and all of them would be very, very familiar with. Again, we struggle with it a little bit because of the mindset we have as Gentiles, but they were right on target and they knew exactly what Daniel was writing about. Now, the people, let me give you a little bit of history. The people of God became very greedy when God started blessing their farms and their cattle and their sheep and all of that. And so instead of letting the land rest, they continued to work. They continued to work and enjoy it. And there was a strong warning in 2 Chronicles. I'll read it, but you just write it down. You don't have to turn there. 2 Chronicles 36, 20 and 21 says this. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon. Those who did not die, They escaped from the sword. That is, they did not die. It says he carried them away to Babylon. Then it says, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the king of Persia. That's who overthrew the Babylonians. Now listen to it again. Till the fulfillment of the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah unto the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, her sevens. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept her Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. They refused to let the land rest during that Sabbath year. And God said, you know what? I'm going to give the land some rest. I'm going to send you to another country. There won't be any farming. There'll be not by you. There won't be any cattle. There won't be any lambs. I'm going to let my land rest. I told you in the law in Leviticus to do this. You haven't done it at all. In the 800 years of history as a nation, Israel violated 70 of those 7-year Sabbaths, which is 490 years. And for every year they violated, God sent them to Babylon in captivity for 1 year. Now, there's two thoughts here, and I need to say this, and I've got to move on. I'm trying to watch my time as well. Most people say that Israel went into captivity because of their idolatry, which is somewhat true. God warned, He warned. And Israel, the northern kingdom went into captivity, and no doubt idolatry. But there was idolatry in the southern kingdom too. But the bigger picture of that 70-year captivity, they violated those Sabbaths. God said, you knew better. I warned you. The prophets warned you. I poured blessings upon you. And instead of you doing what I told you to do, you lived in selfishness. And so finally, I decided to give my land rest. And the best way to do it was to get you out of the land. So we see in verse 24 now the rest of that verse. First, I said we see the announcement of 70 weeks. Now we see the accomplishment of the 70 weeks. To finish the transgression. Now notice during this 77s, this 490 years, there's a lot of things got to take place, okay? Listen to them. Number one, to finish the transgression. Number two, to make an end of sin. Number three, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Number four, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. Number five, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy. Number six, and to anoint the most holy. No way all of that could have taken place in 490 days, 490 months. The only way this prophecy could be fulfilled is in 490 years. That's the reason, again, we interpret the sevens as years. 70 sevens are determined upon thy people. I put in my notes here, there's a couple of things. There are 6 promised blessings that the Messiah will fulfill in this text. And I broke them down like this. The first 3 show the sacrifice of the Messiah, His sacrifice. Finish the transgression, make an end of sins, and make reconciliation for iniquity. The last 3, the final 3, show not the sacrifice of the Messiah, but the sovereignty of the Messiah. And here they are. Bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up division and prophecy, and anoint the most holy. So Daniel has 6 things that the Messiah must do. Now, in verses 25, 26, and 27, again, there's more clarification as to what Gabriel wants Daniel to understand. The key words here are 2, know and understand. Know and then understand. So now he's going to outline for Daniel, and of course for us, the beginning of the tribulation period. People often wonder, when will it start? Some believe we're already in the tribulation period. I know this message will be at my website here in the next few weeks, and I've been conversing with a gentleman that's somewhat confused on the rapture of the church and some other things. And a lot of people are confused as to the tribulation period. When will it start? It's made plain here. The beginning of the tribulation period is laid out, very plain. Verse 20, verse 25. The 69 sevens or weeks will start the decree to build Jerusalem. Listen to what it says. Now, he's going to outline the tribulation period, but he starts at the beginning. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, 7 sevens, 62 weeks, 62 sevens. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome or troublous times. The exact starting point of the prophecy is plain. The divine clock starts according to this verse. Now, when Nehemiah went back and built the wall, prior to the wall, the city, then the wall. But that's the beginning to rebuild Jerusalem. That's the beginning of this 490 years now. Stay with me. How many years of history does God say is decreed upon Israel? 490 years. So now we see the beginning of it, starting in verse 25. The exact starting point. Now, it took 49 years to do all that they did in the rebuilding and all of that. 49 years or 7 weeks. And then that was toward the end, you could say, of Nehemiah's time, is what most believe. And it included the ministry of Malachi and some of the prophets that we studied later. But the angel tells Daniel there's 62 more weeks, or 62 sevens, or if you do your math correctly, 434 years. Still determined. Hasn't happened yet. Or at that writing, it hadn't happened. So he's thinking in terms of, okay, there's 490, 49 is accomplished, 62 years, 434 plus the 49 is 483 years of history. Now, 483 years of history. 400, stay with me, of the 483 of the 490 has happened. Literally. Literally. Not figuratively, not well, it's an allegory and it doesn't mean, no, it has literally taken place. Remember, Daniel is praying, God, when will it literally take place? When will the Jews be back in the land? When will the temple be built? So he's not asking for figurative terms. He's asking for literal terms. And so now we got a real issue. 483 years has already happened. But there's 7 more years. There's 7 more years of Bible prophecy related to Israel, the Jews, and the Gentiles. Now, I wasn't going to do this, but I want you to, we're going to turn there. I'll cut the Antichrist message short a little bit to get you to do this. Turn to the book of Luke, chapter 19. It's not in your notes. I wondered about this, and I thought, well, I may not have time, and I've just come to the conclusion that sometimes you don't have time, and you can't make time, so you just use time. So I'm going to use some time. Luke chapter 19. It's a very, very familiar passage, verse 41. But it's so important because it figures into this period. It absolutely does. Now in Luke chapter 19 and verses 41 through 44, I'm going to read it, but let me give you a little bit of the context. Jesus is headed to the cross. He's headed back to Jerusalem, okay? Got a host of people. Now listen to it. And listen to what he says in regard to this event. Luke 19:41. And when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it, saying, if thou hast known, even thou, at least in this, notice that statement, thy day, this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the day shall come upon thee that thine enemies shall cast a trench round about thee and compass thee round about, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another, because, and notice this, because thou knewest not the time of thy visitation. Israel missed the time clock. Now, thank God that it opened the door for the Gentiles to be brought in, okay? 483 years of history literally took place And before that last 7 years could begin to take place, the Messiah, as we're going to see in the next verse, was cut off. In other words, he was put to death. One of the reasons people often wonder, why did Jesus weep? And the ideal here is he wept uncontrollably. I'll tell you why. Because he knew their day of appointment was right then. And they were saying, nope. Don't want it, don't need it, not looking for it. And Jesus literally wept. And what did God do? In a sense, and this is a poor analogy, but in a sense, God said, time out with the Jews and Jerusalem. Time out. 483 years, time out. Those last 7 years, I'll take care of it later on. My son's going to die for the world, and he's going to build a church. And so now at 483 years, it's complete. Now the church age, if you look at your diagram, is brought in. The 7 years that belonged to the Jews and Jerusalem have been put on hold. Once the church is taken out in the rapture, the tribulation period, the last 7 years of human history prior to Jesus coming back will take place. Will take place. So the 69 weeks or sevens will start at the decree to build Jerusalem. They will stop at the arrival of Jesus in verse 26. Listen to what it says. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off. And I love this statement, but not for himself. Amen. Not for himself. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do one thing wrong, but he was cut off. He was crucified. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood unto the end of war. Desolations are determined. Let me drop down to the end of it, verse 27, because I want to go to Revelation here in just a moment. And by the way, let me say before I read this verse, right now, we are living between the 69th and the 70th week, which we conveniently call it the church age, which is what Paul called it. And he called it a mystery as well. So we're living in that church age. But as sure as the 483 years of history took place, literally, the last 7 years of the tribulation period will literally take place. Now let's look at verse 27, the ending of it. And he shall confirm the covenant with many 1 week. 1 week is 7. So 7 years. Remember, the context here is years. So this person is going to confirm a covenant for 7 years. The he points back to the prince of verse 26 or the Antichrist, as we'll see in our next lesson. The covenant not only will be signed during this period, it will be severed or be broken during this time. Verse 27, listen to what it says. We see the cancellation of this treaty, and in the midst of the week, or the middle of that 7-year period. Now, during that time, Israel will be allowed to go back and rebuild the temple. They'll sign a peace treaty that will amount to literally nothing. It's all temporary. And then secondly, we'll see the desecration of the temple. He shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abomination he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation that was determined to be poured upon the desolate. Now there's many verses that talk about the Antichrist and what he's going to do. Even Jesus warned he'll come into the temple, he'll desecrate the temple. He told the Jews to flee to the mountains, flee to the hillsides, because at that time there will be not only tribulation, but from the middle of the period to the end of the period, there'll be great tribulation. Let's look at the last point quickly, number 4, the manifestation of this time. We see the reality of it. I just want to give you some scriptures to write in. I'm not going to take the time to write them, but I wanted to give you some evidence from the Old Testament and New Testament, the reality of the tribulation period. Write down Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 30 and 31. These are great passages to study on your own. Another Old Testament passage, Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7. And then a New Testament passage, 2 of them, actually. Matthew chapter 24, verses 21 and 22. speaks of great tribulation. And then 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3, talks about sudden destruction and travail coming upon the whole world. Then the reasons for the tribulation period. And yes, I've got them in your notes, so let me just basically look at them quickly. The tribulation period, first of all, brings to a close the end of the age. It will close out human history. Secondly, the tribulation period will confirm the wickedness of man. It'll just prove what Jesus said and Paul said, that in the last days things will wax worse and worse. Then number 3, the tribulation period will be a time for God to punish the Gentile nations. The Gentile nations. You think about it. Now, America has been good to Israel, but think of all of the other Gentile nations. They would wipe Israel off the face of the earth if given a moment. Tribulation period, number 4, will prepare the nation of Israel for her Messiah. She missed Jesus the first time, but Israel will recognize Jesus when he comes back the next time. And then number 5, the tribulation period allows God to reveal the Antichrist as well as the end times. The end times. Now, with that thought in mind, I know I'm really putting it on you thick and heavy. Turn to Revelation. I said chapter 14, but I meant chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, and let's spend just a little bit of time looking at the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast. And it's a very popular subject when I'm preaching or teaching on prophecy. That's one of the lessons that everybody wants to be a part of and they don't want to miss. And so we see it in Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 through 18. I'm going to mostly talk through the outline that you have. And again, because of time, not try to cover everything. But you see that John mentions in this text, verses 11 through 15, he mentions the call for supporting the mark of the beast. There'll be a call that people will have to support this. And in fact, there'll be more than a call. There'll be a challenge. And during that time, people will either have the mark of the beast and from a human point of view, be able to survive, or reject the mark of the beast and be almost impossible to live. And so let's look at chapter 13. It's very important in regard to the end times as well, much like Daniel chapter 9. Now you see a couple of images here, beast as they're called, and that we need to look at them as we move along and try to describe who they are. Now the false prophet will deceive during that time. The false prophet will deceive multitudes upon and I probably should change that into millions upon millions of people during that time. And that'll be one of the mechanisms he uses, is he'll use persecution, absolutely, but he'll use deception as well. Jesus warned the Jews about this in Matthew 24, verse 11, and then again in verse 24. He warned them time and time again. Now, John gives us a picture of this deception in verse 11. And I beheld another beast come up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Now, we must not forget that both of these beasts are real people. They're real people. And we know that because later on they will be cast into the lake of fire. So those who try to say this is all symbolic, I mean, how do you cast symbolism in a lake of fire? That's the reason I've said over and over that I interpret the book of Revelation literally, unless there's something in the text that suggests it's symbolic. I'll just take it for what it says on the page. Even if I don't quite understand it, I find it's easier to take it literally and accept what God says than try to figure out myself, well, what's going on? Maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. So we see the picture of, there's a picture of deception here. He has the image of a lamb. That's the image of the false prophet. I'm not surprised that the false prophet would have the image of a lamb. Usually when deception is used, many times it's used with a measure of truth just to capture the minds of the people, just to deceive them. And the image of the lamb that describes him. Now, a lamb would appear to be somebody humble, maybe even somebody harmless, somebody innocent, somebody that's religiously clean. And so that's how he appears, but he speaks as a dragon. That's just like the devil, isn't it? We not only see a picture of this deception, verse 12, we see the power of it. And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast. The first beast is the Antichrist now, okay? So the false prophet is encouraging everybody. And later on we'll see that he's doing more than encouraging, forcing, in a sense, everybody to worship the first beast, the Antichrist. And let me explain it, maybe this way will help too. The Antichrist is sort of the political arm of the devil's work, okay? And the false prophet that appears as a lamb is the religious arm of the devil's work. So we see in the last days, an easy way for me to explain it is we see politics and religion coming together. Now, I'm not surprised by that because we do see that in the Old Testament with Pharaoh, with Balaam, and some of the others. So here's the devil doing all of his work as fast as he can, involving political people as well as religious people. Now, there seems to be a miracle here. The false prophet will perform miracles to a measure. We see in verse 13, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of the people. There's only one prophet, really, that could call fire down from heaven. That was Elijah. And when Malachi closed his book in the last chapter, he spoke of the coming of Elijah to the earth. Here's this false prophet coming across just like Elijah. And by the way, the Jews are still looking for Elijah to come. In fact, I am told, I don't know this, but I am told that they always have a special seat for Elijah when they observe religious Jewish holidays. Well, they are looking for him to come back. All of a sudden, here's the false prophet doing what only Elijah could do. No wonder there'll be multitudes, millions of Jews, by the way, that will be deceived. We see his message in verse 14. He deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by the sword and did live. Now, most believe, and I do, there's some kind of wound that the beast will suffer. Most believe, and there's no verification of it in Scripture, probably some kind of assassination. We don't know that for sure. But there will be a wound, and the beast will be healed of it. And now, let me hurry up. Look at verse 16. John mentions the command for receiving the mark in first part of the verse, and he calls it all. He points back to verse 11. The false prophet, and you could say the Antichrist together, causes all to receive the mark. All would include Jew and Gentile, by the way. Everybody living in that day. And I want you to notice in the latter part, both small, and notice these couplets here. Both small and great, couplet number 1, rich and poor, couplet number 2, free and bond, couplet number 3. The first group, small and great, probably refers to adults, young and old. But I think the ideal is this. In these couplets, he includes all of humanity will be demanded to have this mark. I want to drop all the way down to verse 17. He mentions the consequences of accepting the mark, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, the name of the beast, and the number of his name. Now, everybody's going to be required to get the mark to be able to survive. But I think it's more than a social decision. It's more than an economical decision. I think receiving the mark of the beast during that time will be a spiritual decision as well, with spiritual, eternal consequences. Now, I've divided, and I need to wrap up, but I've placed all of the people in that age, in that last half, or during the tribulation period, I put them in 3 different categories. And this is not in your outline, but these are reasons why I believe people will receive the mark. At least 3. There's probably a dozen, but there are 3 that to me that come to my mind and to the surface. Number 1, some will receive the mark because they are convinced of the message of the false prophet. They'll believe the Antichrist is the Messiah. They'll take the mark. They'll swallow hook, line, and sinker. They'll be convinced, they'll take it. Others will take the mark because they are careless in their decision making. They'll say something like this: well, I don't have any choice. I've got to do it. My family's got to live. I got to live. We got to have food on the table. And remember, this is worldwide. So all the economy will be dictated by this mark. And so they'll just be careless, and they'll see it as a social, economical decision rather than a spiritual. Then a third group, there'll be those who are cowards. They'll take it because they're afraid not to take it. They'll take it because they're afraid not to. And then John closes out in verse 18, identifying the mark. I'm not going to go into great detail and see if I can convince you who the Antichrist is going to be. There's no need in doing that. I don't think we can name that person in our day and age, and I don't think that's the gist of the text here. But John does mention recognizing the beast and identifying his mark. I'm just honestly glad that during that time, that is the last 7 years of the tribulation period, will be gone. Church will be gone. And the last 7 years of human history is what I call it, will run its course just as God decreed in Daniel chapter 9, 20 through 27. Let me pray. Our Father, we thank you for these verses. Lord, there's just so much here and so much to digest. I pray that we've challenged everybody that maybe in their own personal and devotional time they can deepen their study into these Bible verses. In Jesus' name I pray.